Janet drummed her fingers impatiently against the steering wheel, glancing anxiously at the clock on the dashboard. The rain outside fell in heavy sheets, drumming relentlessly against the roof of her car. She was already running late for her meeting, an important one, with clients she couldn't afford to disappoint. She squinted through the windshield, trying to make out the blurry tail lights of the car in front of her. The wipers worked furiously, but the downpour blurred everything. Her mind raced, going over the details she'd rehearsed for the meeting. The product launch had to go well, and she couldn't let anything jeopardize it. As her thoughts drifted, the car in front of her suddenly slowed down. Janet, lost in her thoughts, didn't react fast enough. Her car jolted forward as she rear-ended the car ahead of her. The impact was jarring but minor. Just a fender bender. Janet's heart raced as she stared at the rear bumper of the car in front of her, now slightly crumpled. Her pulse thundered in her ears, matching the intensity of the rain that continued to pour. She bit her lip. She was already late. She couldn't afford to stop and deal with this now. Glancing in the rearview mirror, she saw no cars behind her. The road was practically deserted, save for the two of them. The rain made it hard to see the driver in the other car, but she could tell they weren't moving. For a split second, she considered pulling over. But the meeting. She needed to get to the meeting. The accident seemed minor, and she could deal with the consequences later. She convinced herself it wasn't a big deal. Maybe the driver wouldn't even care. After all, no one appeared to be hurt. With a quick glance around, Janet pressed down on the accelerator and drove off. As her car sped away, her chest tightened with guilt, but she pushed it down. "It's fine," she whispered to herself. It was just a bump. No one was hurt. Unbeknownst to Janet, the man in the other car had watched her leave, his knuckles white as he gripped the steering wheel. His breath came in shallow, uneven gasps as he stared at the empty seat beside him. His pregnant wife, just moments before, had been in excruciating pain. They had been on their way to the hospital when Janet had crashed into them. The impact had worsened her condition, and the silence that now filled the car was unbearable. She was gone. As Janet's car disappeared into the rain, the man's heart twisted with unbearable grief and rage. His world had just collapsed, and the person responsible for it had fled. He closed his eyes for a moment, then opened them with a new resolve. His wife was dead, but Janet was still out there. She was still breathing. He would make sure that wouldn't last. The rain continued its relentless assault on the streets as Janet pulled into the parking lot of the office building. She checked her reflection in the mirror, tidied her hair, and took a deep breath. The guilt from the accident lingered in the back of her mind, but she forced herself to push it away. There were more important things to focus on now. The meeting went smoothly. Janet was able to charm the clients, presenting her ideas flawlessly. Her confidence grew as the evening wore on, and by the time the meeting wrapped up, she felt a wave of relief. It had been a success. All the tension from earlier had faded. She stepped outside into the night, feeling the cool rain hit her skin. The streets were quiet, the city almost eerily still in the late hour. The rain had slowed to a light drizzle, and the only sound was the faint trickle of water running into the gutters. Janet walked to her car, her heels clicking on the wet pavement. The dim streetlights cast long, distorted shadows across the road. She opened the door, threw her briefcase onto the passenger seat, and slid into the driver's seat. As she turned the key in the ignition, she noticed a movement in the rearview mirror. A car was parked across the street, its headlights off. It hadn't been there when she'd arrived, but maybe she had just overlooked it. She shook off the unease that crept up her spine and pulled out of the parking lot. As she drove down the deserted streets, the feeling of being followed grew stronger. The headlights from the car behind her flickered on, illuminating the road behind her. She glanced in the mirror, her pulse quickening. The car stayed close, its lights blindingly bright in the rain-slicked night. A surge of panic swelled in her chest. She pressed harder on the gas, trying to put distance between them, but the car sped up to match her pace. The road ahead was dark and winding, the rain making visibility even worse. Janet's heart raced. She didn't know who was behind her, but something told her this wasn't a coincidence. Maybe the driver from earlier? No, it couldn't be. That was impossible. The accident had been minor. No one could be this angry over a simple fender bender, right? Her car swerved slightly as she tried to think clearly, but the headlights behind her grew closer, almost pushing her. She made a sharp turn onto a side road, hoping to lose the car, but it followed, relentless. Suddenly, her phone rang. She fumbled to answer, keeping one hand on the wheel. A deep, gravelly voice crackled through the speaker. "You left her to die." Janet's blood turned to ice. She didn't recognize the voice, but the venom in it was unmistakable. "Who is this?" she demanded, her voice trembling. "You didn't even stop," the voice continued, calm, but filled with a deep, simmering rage. "You didn't care that she was dying in front of me." Janet's heart pounded in her chest. She glanced at the rearview mirror again. The car behind her was closing in. "You took her from me," the voice said, now barely above a whisper. "And now I'm going to take you." Her car lurched as the vehicle behind her slammed into her rear bumper. Janet screamed, gripping the steering wheel, as the rain-soaked road twisted and turned ahead of her. The car behind her rammed her again, harder this time, forcing her closer to the edge of the road. Her breath came in ragged gasps. She saw an upcoming intersection and swerved abruptly, hoping to shake her pursuer. But the other car followed her every move. Panic surged within her as she realized there was no escaping him. She turned onto a narrow, deserted road that led into a dense forest. The trees loomed overhead, casting eerie shadows on the wet pavement. The car behind her had its high beams on, and Janet could barely see in front of her. She drove deeper into the woods, the road becoming narrower and more treacherous. Then, in the blink of an eye, the headlights behind her disappeared. Janet slammed on the brakes, her heart pounding in her chest. The forest was pitch black around her, and she sat in stunned silence for a moment, unsure of what had just happened. Had she lost him, or had he disappeared on his own? She looked around, the rain still lightly falling, but there was no sign of the car that had been tailing her so closely. Her hands shook as she gripped the steering wheel. Suddenly, her phone buzzed again. She hesitated, then glanced down at the screen. It was a text message, just 2 words: "Turn around." Janet's breath caught in her throat as she slowly lifted her gaze to the rearview mirror. The reflection staring back at her wasn't hers. And then, just like that, Janet was gone. Her car was found the next morning, abandoned on the side of the road deep in the forest, with no sign of her. The police conducted an extensive search, but she was never found. Some say her disappearance was an accident, others that it was something more sinister. But no one could explain the single handprint left smeared across the rearview mirror, one that didn't belong to Janet.
Jan had always lived a quiet life in his suburban neighborhood. It was the kind of place where everyone greeted each other with a nod or a wave, but no one really intruded on anyone else's space. That was one of the reasons Jan liked it so much. Privacy. The houses were spaced just far enough apart that it felt isolated, but close enough for comfort. He had always been a solitary person, preferring the company of books and his thoughts, rather than socializing with neighbors. Then there was his new neighbor, Mr. Roy. Mr. Roy had moved in just a month ago, and from the first day, he seemed different from everyone else. While other neighbors respected personal space, Mr. Roy was the opposite, always wanting to chat, offering baked goods, or inviting Jan over for dinner. At first, it seemed innocent enough, just a friendly man trying to settle into a new community. But as the days went by, Jan began to feel an unsettling tension around him. It wasn't something he could easily explain. Mr. Roy was polite, sure, and his outward demeanor was always warm, but there was something in the way he lingered a little too long when talking, how his smile never quite reached his eyes, and how his hands always seemed too fidgety. It was nothing Jan could pinpoint exactly, but it nagged at him. Still, Jan tried to be a good neighbor. He would accept an invitation every now and then, just to be polite. But he could never shake the feeling that something was off about the man. Things took a strange turn one night, after a particularly awkward dinner at Mr. Roy's house. It was late, past midnight, when Jan heard noises coming from Roy's house. He couldn't make out what it was at first, but it sounded like faint dragging followed by a dull thud. He tried to ignore it, chalking it up to normal household sounds. But curiosity got the better of him. After all, it wasn't the first time he had heard strange noises coming from his neighbor's house late at night. The next morning, Jan casually brought up the noise to Roy, hoping for an innocent explanation. But Roy's reaction was strange. He smiled, but his eyes were cold. "Ah, you must be hearing things, Jan. This neighborhood is so quiet it can play tricks on the ears," he said, dismissing it with a wave of his hand. That was when Jan decided something was very wrong. He began spying on Roy, peeking out his window at odd hours to see if he could catch him doing something suspicious. And soon enough, Jan's suspicions deepened. On several occasions, he saw Roy leaving the house late at night with large, heavy bags. He never saw what was inside, but the way Roy handled them sent a chill down his spine. One rainy evening, when Roy left in his usual sneaky manner, Jan decided to follow him. Pulling on a dark raincoat, Jan kept his distance as Roy trudged through the storm, carrying another one of his mysterious bags. Jan followed him through the narrow, empty streets until Roy stopped at the edge of the forest. There, to Jan's horror, Roy began digging a hole in the mud, burying the bag deep in the earth. The contents of the bag spilled slightly, and Jan caught a glimpse of what appeared to be human bones. Panic set in. Jan stumbled backward, knocking over a trash can in his haste. Roy snapped his head in Jan's direction, his eyes locking onto him through the dark rain. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then Roy smiled, a cruel, knowing smile, and Jan turned and ran. Back home, Jan locked his door and windows, his heart pounding in his chest. What had he seen? A killer. Roy was a killer, and Jan had just uncovered his secret. For the next few days, Jan avoided Roy entirely, refusing to answer the door when Roy came knocking, asking if everything was okay. But Jan's paranoia only grew. He couldn't stop thinking about those bones. He was sure Roy knew he had been spying, and it was only a matter of time before something happened. His fears were confirmed one night when he awoke to a soft tapping on his window. Jan's bedroom was on the second floor, and there should have been no way anyone could reach the window. But as he peered through the rain-streaked glass, his heart sank. Roy was there, standing on the balcony, grinning up at him, his fingers tapping rhythmically on the window pane. Jan scrambled out of bed, heart racing, and grabbed his phone to call the police, but the line was dead. Panic surged through him. He raced downstairs to check the doors, but as he reached the living room, the front door creaked open. Roy stood in the doorway, dripping wet from the rain, holding a long kitchen knife. "Jan," Roy said softly, stepping inside, "I know what you've been up to. I know you've been watching me." Jan backed away, trembling, his mind racing for a way out. Roy's voice was calm, almost soothing. "You shouldn't have spied on me, Jan. You shouldn't have meddled." Jan darted towards the back door, but Roy was quicker, blocking his path. The rain outside thundered down, matching the frantic beat of Jan's heart. "I didn't want it to come to this," Roy said, stepping closer, his knife gleaming in the dim light. "But now you know too much." Jan grabbed a nearby chair, hurling it at Roy, and made a desperate dash for the stairs. His feet pounded up the steps 2 at a time as Roy followed, his footsteps slow and deliberate. Jan burst into his bedroom and slammed the door shut, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He grabbed a heavy lamp and stood by the window, praying for a way out. But Roy was relentless. A loud crash echoed as Roy kicked in the door, his eyes wild, his smile twisted into something monstrous. "You thought you could spy on me and get away with it?" Roy hissed, raising the knife. "You're just like the others, Jan. I won't let you ruin my life." Just as Roy lunged forward, Jan swung the lamp with all his strength, striking Roy in the head. Roy staggered back, dazed, but it wasn't enough to stop him. The knife glinted as it slashed through the air, barely missing Jan. In the chaos, Jan managed to break the window and scramble out onto the roof. The rain poured down in sheets, making the shingles slippery beneath his feet. Roy followed, his movements slow but purposeful. Jan didn't look back. He leapt from the roof, landing hard on the wet grass below, and bolted into the night. The police found him hours later, soaked and shaking, but alive. When they searched Roy's house, they found more than just bones. Evidence of unspeakable horrors buried beneath the surface of that friendly facade. Roy had been hiding his crimes for years, but it was Jan's curiosity that had uncovered the truth, a truth that had almost cost him his life. Jacqueline had always been professional at work, keeping her relationships with co-workers strictly business. But Mark, a quiet, introverted man, had recently developed an unsettling fixation on her. His stares lingered too long, and his conversations always veered toward the personal. She had tried to gently deflect his advances, but when Mark finally confessed his feelings outright, she had no choice but to reject him. She was polite but firm, thinking that would be the end of it. That evening, a heavy rain fell, casting a dark, oppressive mood over the office. The sound of raindrops pattered against the windows as Jacqueline finished up her work. The office was mostly empty, save for the occasional shuffle of footsteps in the hall. She was relieved to finally pack up and head home. But just as she stood to leave, she noticed Mark, sitting a few desks away, staring at her with an intensity that sent chills down her spine. His eyes weren't filled with sadness or disappointment. No, they burned with something far darker. Anger, resentment. He said nothing, just kept watching her, his gaze boring into her as the rain intensified outside. Jacqueline's pulse quickened. She hurriedly grabbed her things and exited the office, not daring to look back. Outside, the rain soaked her instantly, but she welcomed it, hoping it would wash away the eerie encounter. The streets were nearly deserted, the dim streetlights flickering in the heavy downpour. She could hear the distant hum of traffic, but the world around her felt unnervingly quiet. As Jacqueline walked down the narrow, shadowy street, a sudden sound behind her made her freeze. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, splashing in the rain. She didn't want to turn around, didn't want to confirm what she already feared. But when the footsteps grew louder, closer, she couldn't help it. She glanced over her shoulder. Mark was following her. Her heart pounded. She quickened her pace, praying he would stop, that this was just her imagination playing tricks on her. But the footsteps matched her speed, unwavering. Jacqueline's breaths came faster, her mind racing. She was alone, the street long and desolate, with no one around to help. Suddenly, Mark called out, his voice echoing through the rain. "Jacqueline, wait!" Panic surged through her. She broke into a full sprint, her shoes slipping on the wet pavement. The cold rain stung her skin, but all she could think about was getting away. She darted through alleyways, weaving between buildings, desperate to lose him. Finally, she found herself at a dead-end alley, the walls towering around her. There was no escape. Jacqueline turned around, breathless, trembling with fear, as Mark slowly approached, his face shadowed by the rain and darkness. But then, to her shock, Mark stopped. His expression softened, and he dropped something on the ground. "You dropped your keys back at the office," he said quietly, his voice now calm, almost apologetic. Without another word, he turned and disappeared into the rain, leaving Jacqueline in stunned silence.